Thank you for inviting me to come and present to your group. I always enjoy it, and I always enjoy sharing the knowledge and passion. And as was mentioned, the Brolga is a hugely iconic species. It is one of the most iconic species of the Victorian volcanic plains. So here's just a few photos of birds that I did capture during my PhD with bands as well as satellite transmitters, which helped us gather a lot of information that we previously didn't know about the movements and habitat use of Brolgas across the whole southwest Victorian region. So before I start, I would just like to acknowledge all of my supervisors who were part of this, Simon Cook and Grant Palmer at Federation University, Richard Hill at the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Mick McCarthy at University of Melbourne Quantitative and Applied Ecology Group. These are all my old affiliations. I'm now currently working for Biosis, and they have enabled me to come and present here tonight for you. So without further ado, because I do go on a fair bit about Brolgas, I'll introduce the Brolga a little bit further. So it is one of the 15 crane species in the world, and majority of these crane species are threatened globally. The Brolga is not globally threatened. It's considered as least concerned under the IUCN red list criteria, but there are some locally threatened populations within Australia, which I'll explain a little bit more about. So Brolgas occur mostly in Australia, but there are some in southern New Guinea as well, and that population is even less known than the Australian one. In northern Australia, so this map shows you all the records of Brolgas throughout Australia from up to 2009. There are quite a lot more records down south, but this still gives you a really good idea of the countrywide distribution. So you can see that they occur through the northern part and then southeast Australia into New South Wales, Victoria, and then a little bit into South Australia. But they are absent from the dry centre. So they're very much a bird of wetlands and floodplains, so their distribution coincides with the distribution of wetlands and rivers and floodplains across Australia. So as I mentioned before, so in southeastern Australia they are rare and threatened, and they have been in decline since the 1900s. Whereas in northern Australia, they are common and abundant. So it's common to see hundreds of Brolgas, sometimes mixed up with Sarus cranes, especially up in northern Queensland. So hugely common, and they occur in massive flocks that we could only ever dream of seeing in Victoria. And it's actually threatened and listed under state legislation in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. And recently, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning reassessed all the threatened species that have been considered as threatened in the state, and revised a lot of their threatened status using the IUCN criteria, basically looking at overall trends over sort of 30-year time span to look at whether there's been potential declines in those species. And some species, as a result of that process, were upgraded, their threatened status was upgraded, and some of them were listed under the FFG Act, whereas they were previously considered threatened but not listed. And through that process, the Brolga's status went from vulnerable to endangered. So there is concern and evidence that there's actually been a drop in numbers and an ongoing threat to their survival in this state to warrant that reclassification to a higher category of threatened. So what is their population size? In Northern Australia, there haven't been any systematic counts, and really more recently, the only systematic counts have been undertaken in Victoria, and particularly in southwest Victoria. Richard Kingsford has been doing surveys throughout the Murray-Darling Basin for over 30 years now, but they are not focused specifically on Brolgas, even though they are counted. And looking at some of his data compared to our very detailed data where we are trying to actually capture those big flocks, we are getting a better estimate of local population numbers through really local annual effort of counting. So these counts were in southwest Victoria, were originally initiated in the 80s and 90s, and there's been different ways of counting them through several people going out and counting at the sites and then making an estimate. Not always all sites were counted, and sometimes there was a combination of counting sites and calling landholders. So it wasn't in no means a sort of systematic way of actually getting those numbers. Nonetheless, the current sort of understanding and status has definitely improved over the years. So in Northern Victoria, there's an estimate of 50 to 100, and the original estimate was done by Don White, who worked for the department back in the 80s. And then Matt Herring did some really amazing and trailblazing work in Northern Victoria and Southern New South Wales and estimated 50 to 100 through the flocking areas there over summer and throughout his study. In southwest Victoria, White in the 1980s estimated 500 to 550, but he only counted a subset of the flocking sites that we now know of that Brolgas use regularly and in big numbers. Rebecca Sheldon did some further work on flocking areas and came up with a maximum of 675, but those were done over multiple days. And one of the things when I started my work and we were counting together with the department, I ended up recommending that we actually need to do systematic surveys on the same day every year, because the birds can fly from one flocking area to another and potentially result in double counting and wrong estimates. And in the 1990s, in terms of breeding pairs, there's an estimate of about 200 to 250 throughout that southwest Victorian region. So when we consider that southwest Victorian region, which I will be talking about throughout my talk here, it's really from sort of Ballarat all the way out to the South Australian border and southwest around sort of Hamilton, Warrnambool, Casterton, Portland area as well. A loose definition there. So as a result of those annual counts since 2012 that have been done systematically, the highest count we actually came up with was 907, and that included these flocking areas. Sorry, I'm jumping up and down between the projector there. The main flocking areas here in Victoria, as well as the one that straddles the border with South Australia. And that was after 2 years of really high recruitment in the whole population. So after the millennium drought broke, there were lots of pairs that were getting chicks up to fledging, and we assume that basically resulted in high recruitment, high survival, and a really high count in that year. And in summary, the flocking areas in southwest Victoria, we've got some really main big ones, which are the Wollora, Penshurst and Strathdowney. Really need something to point with, but so Wollora is here. Well, I'm not blocking it, am I? Penshurst is just south of Wollora there, and then Strathdowney is there at the far end. Oh, perfect, thank you. Gold. I feel very powerful now. So this is Wollora, which is actually closest to here. So it's southwest of us, and it holds substantial numbers, and it's one of the largest flocking areas we've got in terms of the area and the home ranges that the birds are using. Penshurst, again, is also another large one. So Wollora holds about 160 maximum usually, and that includes the recently restored green swamp that Nature Glen Elk Trust restored, and the Brolgas are absolutely loving it. So they've been increasing there in numbers over the last 3 or so years. Penshurst regularly holds about 200 birds, and Strathdowney, we usually get anywhere between 200 and 300. The sort of more minor sites, which have still got a fairly big flock sizes, are Lake Bolac here, Darlington Dundonnell here, and Streatham, just north of there. And really these can be considered, birds are moving between those, so overall there's a lot of sort of combination of birds through those areas. And then the more minor sites, we've got Cressy and Edenhope. Cressy is here, Edenhope up there. So they hold about 20 to 30 birds. So that's the population size and flocking areas in southwest Victoria, which are extremely important for about 6 to 7 months of the year to the entire Brolga population. In terms of the annual life cycle and their general movements from and to those flocking areas and their habitat requirements. So Brolgas really prefer to breed in these shallow, temporary, seasonally inundated wetlands, which are usually herbaceous and have a lot of emergent vegetation such as Eliocharis or Juncus. And the breeding season extends from July to December. Generally they lay 2 eggs, very rarely 3, and they bring up 1 or 2 chicks. In very wet years, we've noticed that 2 chicks, they can bring up 2 chicks. So as the chicks grow, they get to a point where they eventually fledge, and then the parents and their young, their fledged young, move between November and February to the flocking areas. And flocking areas generally consist of multiple wetlands. So it's not very high resolution or bright photo there, but this is the Wollora flocking area. So there's lots of sort of pockets of wetlands throughout there that they will congregate in those sort of bigger flocks. So the pairs and their young will all come together eventually. On the breeding sites, they are hugely territorial, but once those shallow wetlands dry over the sort of early summer, late spring, early summer period, they are driven to actually move to these flocking areas. So they spend the flocking season in groups from about December to June, and then they'll start moving again between May and June back to their breeding sites once basically there's the seasonal rains start and those seasonally herbaceous wetlands start to fill up again. And at the flocking sites, they do use both saline as well as freshwater wetlands, and generally ones that are fairly open landscape and have got shallow edges. So they like to roost along the shallow edges or walk into the middle of these kinds of wetlands up to about sort of ankle to knee deep, which basically protects them from predators. This diet is also a bit different between the breeding and the flocking seasons. So during the breeding season, there's obviously lots of activity in those shallow wetlands. Lots of invertebrates, there's lots of crustaceans, lots of frogs. So they will feed on all those kinds of animals, as well as potentially also some of the tubers of the wetland plants. And as the chick grows, they get quite mobile after even 1 or 2 weeks. So they will swim in the wetland, but they'll also start walking away from the nesting wetland and use this sort of drier country areas to forage in. And then during the flocking season, the timing of their arrival at these flocking areas coincides with the harvest. So if any of you do get Brolgas on your properties, you might have noticed that timing coincides quite closely with when you've got your harvesters out there and you've got this spilt grain that ends up being left on the ground, which not only Brolgas love, there's also sheldarks and cockatoos and mice that also do get onto them. But yeah, so they'll roost at the wetlands and head out every day for a feed, and mainly to feed on grain, so oats, triticale, barley and wheat. And as the flocking season progresses and with the sort of first onset of rains, you start to get earthworms and the cockchafer beetle grubs, as well as the crickets, start to come out of the ground. And they will feed on all of those. And they are also known to feed on mice. And I have also had a farmer tell me that they've seen Brolgas chasing quail chicks and actually successfully catch them. So it's the food during the breeding season is really more contained in the wetland, whereas the flocking season they do sort of feed outside of the wetlands quite a bit. So as I mentioned, the Brolga is threatened in Victoria, and there is an action statement that's been prepared for it. And the main threats are really habitat loss. So there's been large-scale drainage of those shallow, seasonally inundated wetlands throughout southwest Victoria and the Victorian volcanic plains. And so that is thought to have really made a major difference in the observed decline of Brolgas over time in Victoria. And that has been mainly due to drainage of wetlands as well as cropping. So that actually still is an ongoing threat and continues today. And there was actually quite a lot more drainage throughout or conversion to cropping of wetlands in the millennium drought as well. So predation is also thought to be quite a significant threat, especially for the eggs and the chicks. Not so much for the adults. Once they survive to sort of 12 months and over, they actually have quite a high survival, and once they're adults, they absolutely have high survival, and there's not really any predation risk unless they are injured. So it's thought that foxes are one major predator of the chicks. They are quite good parents, and there are also some native predators that I think we don't really understand very well what their role and how much they contribute to chick loss particularly. So wedge-tailed eagles have been known to take chicks even about that high, and little eagles as well. And purple swamp hens and other native water birds will also eat their eggs. Another fairly significant threat is collisions, particularly from fence lines and power lines. So there are lots of incidents of Brolgas hitting power lines, especially the single or double are the really thin ones. And then fences, particularly these sort of old fences that are ring lock and have got barbed wire double strands on the top. So, especially if they are positioned between wetlands where the birds are constantly crossing and moving through. And that actually affects all the age classes. So chicks, adults and juveniles can get caught in fences. More of a sort of emerging threat in the last decade or so has been the increase in interest of wind farm development in southwest Victoria, which overlaps completely with both the breeding and non-breeding, so the flocking areas of Brolgas in this area. And the actual risk of mortality or disturbance from wind farms is really unknown. So there was big concern in terms of, given that especially we didn't really know anything about the movements of the birds, how wind farms might potentially impact on potentially disturbing and therefore excluding them from habitat, but also from collision, both with the turbines themselves, but then also additional transmission lines that are now going into the landscape in various places. So this is this is just a map that shows the wind speed, so you can kind of see the red areas are where there's highest wind. So you can see that there's fair bit of high wind speeds, average yearly rates in southwest Victoria. And this is just a map from a couple of years ago of wind farms at the time that were popping up in Victoria. And this overlaid with data that shows the Brolga distribution. So you can see that in northern Victoria there are some records, and the Brolga population also occurs there, but majority and the core population is in southwest Victoria, where it overlaps quite directly with those high wind speed areas that the wind farm proponents are interested in developing. So as I mentioned, there's real uncertainty about how it might impact on Brolgas because we don't know anything about their movements, and those movements can put them at risk of being in the colliding with turbines or power lines. So we don't know anything about movements at breeding sites or the non-breeding, the flocking sites, or the movements between them. These what are thought to be seasonal movements. So basically a very incomplete picture of where most of those movements might be occurring and where we might want to avoid potential wind farm risk on the species. And the main thing really with a species that is already threatened and has been subject to decline in terms of its population, you've got existing threats, so if you're adding another threat, it's a real concern whether there's an increase in mortality that might put it at more risk of further declines into the future. So that's where my project really came in terms of my PhD. So the key objective really was to try and find out the movements, behaviour and ecology of Brolgas at multiple spatial and temporal scales, and that basically just means trying to understand how they move at the breeding sites within their home ranges, so within the breeding wetlands and ranging between them, and then how are they moving and where are they moving, where are the locations of these movements or movement paths when they're moving between the breeding and the flocking areas, and then again, how are they moving at the flocking sites, and how big an area they might need to be protected or avoided from potential wind farm impacts. So the project and my work and the research really also had this sort of main aim of conservation application to try and, with the information on the movements, to try and understand where those key and core areas are that should be avoided in terms of wind farm siting at the landscape scale, so across all of southwest Victoria. Where should we avoid entire wind farm locations? And then what kind of exclusion zones should we have around these breeding and the flocking areas as well? And additionally also, the movements and home range and habitat use information can actually be used for conservation purposes on the ground in terms of selecting potential sites for restoration, by identifying where the birds are going and also how much space they might need to be conserved for, say, breeding pair to be successful to fledge chicks. So basically for habitat protection and conservation. So, as I've already mentioned, I undertook my PhD study in Southwest Victoria. This particular figure shows where I actually captured the Brolgas. So I had 2 flocking sites that I was focused in, Penshurst and Wooloora. And that was mainly because those are the ones that hold the most Brolgas every year. And also I captured chicks, so the round circles are where I captured chicks to first put bands on, and then in the second year I'll put GPS transmitters on those birds. So most of them were really focused around the Skipton, Derrinellum, Darlington area, and there was some just south of Penshurst in the Macarthur area as well, and one lonely one up there in Casterton. And that was really determined by where the chicks were present and where there were chicks that were old enough to catch, and where we could get access from landholders to go and catch them. And I actually, to select those sites, was through conversations with landholders, doing some roaming surveys around driving the roads, but I also did some aerial surveys around some of these areas which have got really high density Brolga records existing. So that all kind of helped identify where the chicks were at those times of the year when I was wanting to catch them. So all up, I captured 32 Brolgas, chicks, juveniles and adults, and I attached GPS transmitters on 23 of them. So 12 of them went on chicks that were not fledged yet. 6 went on juveniles. So by juveniles, I mean birds that were born in that year but had already been fledged, but were not older than 12 months. And then 5 adults. So you can see here that I attached colour bands on them, which allow you to identify them and collect not only movement data from the ones that didn't have trackers, but also it's a really good way of understanding survival. And we've also been able to use that resighting and proportion of banded versus unbanded individuals at flocking sites to estimate Victorian population. So lots of really great stuff comes out of colour band resightings, and I was actually surprised that we got a lot of resightings, which is great. And this bird, you can see, also got a GPS transmitter. So for the chicks, we attach them onto a leg band because you can't put them on their back like we did with some of the adults and juveniles because they're still growing. So these guys basically had like a backpack with the GPS tracker on the back. But yeah, you couldn't put them on the chicks because they were continuously growing and they would grow out of that harness and it just wouldn't be safe for them. So all of these 12 chicks, so I had 8 chicks that just got bands and 12 chicks with transmitters. And I was sure, because there's a lot of information about the fact that Brolgas are generally they have really poor breeding success. So I was sure that I would probably lose most of these chicks, and which wouldn't bode so well for the PhD either. But surprisingly and very gladly, they all actually fledged, which was amazing. All 21 chicks that I captured as 6 to 9 week old age, they all fledged and they all dispersed from their breeding sites. So that was a great success. And yeah, adults were caught in 2010 and 2011 also, so over 2 years. In 2012, that was just an additional 2 chicks that we happened to catch at the MacArthur wind farm because there was a pair that happened to have actually had 2 chicks that were ready to catch, and no one had actually managed to get any information on crane chick movements at wind farms previously, so it was a great opportunity to get that data. So in terms of timing of movement, so that was one of the first things I wanted to look at was, do they match kind of what we already know, which is what I mentioned before, that from flocking areas to the breeding sites, they move around May and June. And that was pretty much right. So I've got 2 graphs here, and this one, just focus on the one on the left for now, which compares the adults and the juveniles. And these are basically the movements of the centre of all GPS fixes for each bird for each month. So you can see that in January to April, they're not really moving much. So the distance is there on the x-axis. And then in May, you get some adult movements, and as well as in June, you get both adults and juveniles. And then the juveniles seem to be tending to leave a little bit lower, at least some of them tend to be leaving a little bit later. So that matches with our current knowledge. And then they were returning back to the breeding sites and making these longer distance movements from about November onwards. What was also really interesting was we had those birds that I showed you before that were captured from Penshurst and Wollora, and then these ones that were east of the Hopkins River. And the interesting thing that came out of the data analysis was that it seemed like the birds from Wollora and Penshurst, so around this area, tended to move much longer distances to their breeding sites. So they were moving much further distances than those birds east of Hopkins River. So the Wollora and Penshurst birds are the white ones, and east of Hopkins are the grey ones. So you can see that there's a lot of longer distance movements in these times of the year when they're generally moving between breeding and non-breeding areas. So that was quite interesting. So it seems like there are these 2 different sort of, I guess, movement patterns and behaviours depending on where the birds breed and where they flock. So this picture shows all the tracks of all the individuals that had a GPS tracker on them, overlaid on the Victorian bird life as well as Victorian Biodiversity Atlas breeding data behind it. So you can kind of see the relationship between the movements of the tracked individuals and these breeding sites. The black polygons through here are the flocking sites. So this is Cressy here, where I didn't have any tracked birds, and this is Darlington Dundonnell through to Lake Bolac and Streatham. And those birds from east of Hopkins, they're all in blue. Those birds captured in Wollora are the ones in orange, and those in Penshurst in red. And then there's one individual there from Cladbrow in grey. So you can see here those longer distance movements from Penshurst and Wollora down to the southwest corner of the state. So it seems like these birds that are using the Wollora and Penshurst sites, so majority of the Brolga population really in Victoria are moving up to 100 and over 100 kilometres to their breeding sites. Whereas these guys here tend to be moving much shorter distances, and it could be because around Wollora and Penshurst there aren't that many breeding sites, and I don't actually know whether that's always naturally been like that or whether we've had some loss of wetlands around those sites. Whereas here, east of Hopkins River, there's a lot higher density of those breeding sites near the flocking sites. So this is just a summary that Wooloora and Penshurst, both adults and juveniles, were moving around sort of 100 kilometres. And those east of Hopkins River, so average movements were between 6 and 30 kilometres. So quite a big difference. And this is just another way of looking at some of those movements. So looking at the annual daily and non-breeding flocking area movements. So what I did was, I was really interested to know how far were the birds moving each day from their night roost to their foraging areas. So Brolgas always will roost in a wetland overnight and then move out to feed. At breeding sites, they tend to spend more time actually also foraging within the wetland itself. But that's actually become quite an important sort of information for management purposes, particularly to understand how far are the birds moving from these wetlands, which is kind of like their centre of activity. So how far around wetlands should we be potentially protecting them from disturbance or protecting their foraging areas, that kind of thing. So if looking at all the movements across the entire year for adults and juveniles, and so chicks that had fledged, 1.6 kilometres from wetland. But majority really were within 5.2 kilometres, so about 95%, and only 0.5% were more than 10 kilometres, so these sort of longer distance movements. And this is basically likely to be these sort of seasonal movements between the breeding and non-breeding areas, which happen occasionally, but not very frequently. So most of the time, they're keeping pretty close to their wetland roost sites. And in summer, as I mentioned earlier, so from January to April, they're really tightly kind of confined to near their wetlands. And I think that's really because there's not that many wetlands available at that time of the year. So a lot of them have dried up by then, especially those temporary shallow wetlands. So the ones that are available are the sort of deeper freshwater or the saline wetlands that we've got a lot of in this land care catchment area here, just in the Wooloora flocking area. So these findings in terms of the movements from roost were pretty similar to those that Matt Herring found for Brolga in northern Victoria. And also another researcher in the US who was looking at sandhill cranes. Both of these studies were looking at just the time of the year when they flock, so they're not breeding. And they both found that they can range up to about 5 kilometres from their night roost. So it's pretty close to what I found, even though this is combining all of the movements throughout the whole year, not just the non-breeding period. So here's a bit more information about what the tracking revealed about the non-breeding, the flocking area movements. So I am using those terms interchangeably. So basically, flocking means, and it seems to be a very Australian and particularly Victorian term for how the birds sort of behave at this time of the year, but it is really kind of biologically and as part of their annual life cycle, non-breeding part of their year. So these are the GPS points, locations, for two individuals, a juvenile and an adult, at the Wooloora flocking site. So you can see this is the Maruna Glen Thompson Road here. And they use multiple wetlands throughout that flocking season. So in that period of time from December to June. So what they tend to do is they'll stick around one wetland and move out to feed from there, and then they'll move to another one, either because the wetland dries up or potentially because they have they've been feeding around that wetland to a point where there's probably not that much in terms of food and resources for them to still, sustain that flock at that location. So then they tend to go and feed somewhere else where there's still spilt grain around. And the other thing I did was I've more recently done an analysis of those home ranges. So how big an area do these individuals actually use? And I had multiple individuals over multiple years, adults and juveniles, and basically came up with these home range areas, which is an area that fairly accurately depicts the flocking site area that they are requiring from year to year. So these obviously wetlands are very dynamic in the landscape, and their presence and absence really can change from year to year a fair bit, which you're probably quite aware of. In a year like this, we're going to have lots and lots of wetlands in the landscape. In a drier year, especially at Wooloora, you might only have those saline wetlands remaining. So the Brolgas will use those as they change from year to year, and even within the same season, within the same year, they'll use them differently. They're very opportunistic, and they'll seek out the areas where there's suitable night roosting habitat and food as well. But overall, they tend to kind of come to the same area from year to year, even if they're using different wetlands or different paddocks to feed in each year. So it's really important not to just look at it from, say, one individual point of view or just one month or 1 year, but to look at the overall area used by these birds over a much longer period of time because of the very dynamic nature of their environment. So these depict those multiple years, multiple use of individuals' home ranges in southwest Victoria. So that's Wooloora there. So you can see it's quite a large area overall when you combine all that data. So we've now actually got a really good understanding of their sort of area that they need around these flocking sites that we've always known their location, but now we've got a much better idea of how big an area they actually need. So just to reiterate, they use multiple wetlands. They do also use dams, farm dams, and particularly in those dry years, farm dams and even stock troughs are actually really important water sources for them. So they'll hang, you can see, 10, sometimes 100 around a dam or a trough. And as I mentioned, they feed on crops and basically use pasture as well within their home ranges in between those wetland areas. So I'll move on to giving a bit of information about breeding home ranges now. How am I going for time? Okay, good. So this is again looking at how far the chicks moved from the wetland that they were roosting in at night to where they were going to feed during the day. So this is what's called a frequency distribution. So it's basically just all the movement distances, and looking at how many were in each one of these distance classes of 100 metres. So on average, they were moving just over 400 metres from the night roosts. 50% of these movements were within 315 metres, and 95% were within 1.5 kilometres. So they will sometimes walk a little further. And remember that these are really small chicks, they're not flying yet, so they are actually capable of walking up to 2 kilometres. There was one chick, or pair of chicks actually, that were walking 1.6 kilometres every day from their night roost to a foraging area and then back again. So 3.2 kilometres a day, which is, pretty phenomenal for... Yeah, exactly. Must have been a good spot they were going to. So then I also did the analysis to look at, okay, how big an area are the Brolgas using at these breeding sites? And these are the chick movements, but you can sort of take them as the movements of the family because they will move together fairly tightly. So night locations are the blue triangles, day locations are the yellow circles, and these are the tracks between those fixes. So the interesting thing was that we had basically three main situations or scenarios where chicks used and the family used a single wetland until the chick fledged. And this is quite a large wetland here. Or they used multiple wetlands where they switched the wetland in which they roosted. So they'd roost in one, then roost in another. So they were moving between multiple wetlands until they fledged. And then the third scenario was they would actually completely relocate from their original capture location to a different wetland altogether. Home range was hugely different between sites. So it varied from 70 hectares to 524 hectares. And as I mentioned, multiple wetlands were used before the chicks fledged. So one thing I was going to, or hoping to show you was the Brolga records around the Upper Hopkins land care group area to give you an idea of where your breeding and non-breeding areas and records are. There's not a lot of breeding sites here. I can send Asha a map that she can then share with all of you down the track, so you can actually see where there might be some records in relation to your properties as well. But majority, there's a few scattered around, but most of the breeding sites are actually further south and also towards like Lake Borlock, Streatham starts having quite a few down there. But there are still lots of, obviously the Willora flocking site is right there, so it's a very important area from that perspective. And it's even possible that with some care and conservation and management of wetlands that are currently not functioning as wetlands could actually improve that situation for Brolgas into the future. So the main management implications really to come out of my study are absolutely crucial to include multiple wetlands. So historically, it's been really common to just manage Brolga breeding wetlands as single wetlands, just the nesting site. But it's really important to actually consider them as these sort of wetland complexes, because that's how the birds are using them until the birds are fledging. And having multiple wetlands is really important for the breeding success then. Although they can obviously also fledge from single wetlands, but just for example, fencing a nesting wetland may not be such a great thing because the birds could be actually needing to move to other wetlands as the chick's growing, and then you're creating a barrier potentially for that chick movement, and then it may be more at risk of predation or getting separated from the parents or getting entangled in the fence. Absolutely the same goes for the flocking sites. So as I showed you, the GPS tracking has revealed that they are using multiple wetlands and cropping areas to forage in, but that multiple wetland complexes, that's what Brolgas need throughout their life cycle, both the breeding and flocking sites. So that's the real takeaway, and I think it's really important to kind of also think about the fact that that requires lots of community collaboration and cooperation, because you'd want to be working with multiple landholders across an area to protect these wetlands that the birds are using. So some other things that landholders can do in terms of Brolga conservation and protection is, in terms of fencing, avoid putting new fences in if you can. And if you are putting in new fences, think about wildlife-friendly, crane-friendly fencing, and I can send Ash a link on that as well. There's quite a good piece on the Auscrane site about how to take that into consideration. And also, in terms of power lines, if you do have power lines, or if you've got power lines where you may have observed dead Brolgas, or you know anyone else who has, you can mark them. So marking has been shown to reduce collisions of birds, including cranes overseas, quite a lot. So that's an effective strategy to reduce mortalities on your properties or within your region, within your land care group. And also, but raising that awareness, I think, is really important as well to get more people on board. And the other thing is to really focus on habitat management, wetland habitat management, protecting, restoring, and really thinking about protecting and restoring multiple wetlands. So here are 3 wetlands that Brolga's actually used. Unfortunately, it has now been drained. But that's really important to kind of get more breeding wetlands in the landscape and keep the ones we've got and really reduce any draining or land use changes from the current sort of wetland condition. And at flocking areas, really the main thing is to reduce and avoid disturbance, because the birds are quite wary and they can be quite affected by disturbance, and they may move from one area to another if they are disturbed, especially at those roost sites, which are really important at night, but also during the day for drinking and thermoregulation, so keeping their body at a certain temperature so that they don't cook. And also one thing that actually has, one of the things I've observed, and one thing that I think the green swamp restoration has also shown, is it does seem like, even at the flocking areas, they seem to first prefer those freshwater wetlands. So I think if we can try and get more freshwater wetlands restored and maintained in the landscape, that's a good thing even at the flocking sites. So that ends my presentation. Thank you so much for listening and for your interest. I hope I've provided you with some sort of tips to take away, as well as some new information and interesting information on Brolga ecology and the findings from my PhD, particularly as it comes to the movements. And the project would not have been possible without an amazing range of financial supporters, as well as my supervisors and absolutely the landholders in southwest Victoria. If I hadn't been able to get onto their properties, and if they hadn't welcomed me onto them and catch their Brolgas, the project would not have ever happened, because 90% of Brolga habitat in Victoria is on private land. So it's crucial to have their support and understanding, and they were just amazing. And I had lots of volunteers and friends, and also Serendip Sanctuary rangers who actually trained me and helped me in the training, the capture process, and all those methods. And thank you all. And I'm happy to take any questions.
That was really good, really interesting. Have we got time for some questions?
Yeah, a couple of questions, but I'm going to jump on and let the other people join the meeting. That's okay?
Yeah.
So go ahead and ask
Yep.
if you have any questions. Don't mind me.
Any questions?
Yep.
How long do they live for?
That's a really good question. So what we've found from the banding so far is that the oldest ones we're getting are about 11 years old. I wouldn't be surprised if they live to 20 to 30. Similar age cranes overseas are known to have lived to 15 years of age, but these birds are coming back to the same breeding site, so I suspect they probably live even longer. So I'm hoping we keep getting some information from those boundary sightings. there are still a handful out there that we keep seeing each year, which is really nice. So we can keep collecting that information, but at least 11 years old.
And how do you catch them?
Right, yes, that's a really good question. I didn't have that detail in there. So chicks, what we do is it's called active pursuit or rundown method, which probably describes it pretty well. So you spot a family with a chick and you basically spot them from a distance and then you run like hell. And what happens is that the parents actually drop the chick. They tell them to hide. So then you try and find where that chick is, pick it up and process it and put it back, and yeah, the parents come back to it like that. So, and the other method I used was cannon netting, which sounds quite severe and exciting. I only did that once, so we used big net, which has got projectiles and gunpowder that basically throws the net over the birds, and you can catch more than one with that. So we caught one family. And the method that ended up working the best in the end for the juveniles and the adults, which obviously are harder to catch because they can fly and they're really wary, I tricked them. So I used their call to attract them to a paddock, which I'd seen them feeding in before. And then I had 2 taxidermy Brolgas in the middle of the paddock, which were surrounded by noose lines which were made from fishing line, so basically booby-trapped. And so we played the call of the Brolga first thing in the morning before they left from their night rest, and they came to that paddock, landed in front of us, and then the taxidermy Brolgas were like magnets, so the birds that landed in the paddock would just come straight towards them. So they'd get caught in the nooses, and then we'd run like hell again. Yeah.
I have a question about water quality.
Mm.
Do they care? Does it matter if it's a salty wetland or any other water quality elements?
That's a really good question as well. So Brolgas can tolerate some level of salinity as opposed to some other species of cranes, and they've actually got these glands in their beak that filters out salt.
Yep.
As far as I understand, the breeding sites themselves have to be fresh water. They do. There are some coastal wetlands. I don't know how saline they are, whether they are spring fed. I know that a lot of Brolga nests are spring fed. So it'd actually be really interesting to look into that.
Yep.
Yeah.
One of your charts seemed to show, I think you said that showed the juveniles were moving later by themselves, quite a distance.
Yep.
Does that mean they know where to go and that when they have no adults with them, they know where to fly to?
Well, so actually what they do often is they'll go back with the parents to the breeding site, same one they were born at. But when the parents start breeding again, the juveniles get kicked out, and then they generally either fly back or they start bouncing around in the landscape looking for somewhere to go, and you'll often end up with these juvenile flocks, kind of like bachelor and bachelorette groups that end up moving a lot in the landscape because they don't really know that landscape or where the wetlands are yet. All they've known is where the breeding site is and where their parents have taken them to the flocking site. So that's what that sort of longer distance movements really reflect, not necessarily even just a single long distance movements, but then juveniles start just, bouncing around in the landscape quite a lot. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the map with the Brolga movement and then the Brolga movement that went east.
Yeah.
Is there a theory about why they don't cross over there, why it's so distinct in the directions they took?
No, the only kind of hypothesis I came up with is if Brolgas have originally kind of colonised the southeast Australia and Victoria South Australia in north to south kind of direction, that perhaps the ones east of Hopkins River have become saturated, so there's no more breeding sites there anymore. So the ones from Villora and Penshurst, if they went that way, there wouldn't be any breeding sites. So whereas the rainfall and wetland availability is, again, much more reliable once you get down to southwestern Victoria, like around Casterton and Portland and South Australia. Yeah. But yeah, it's actually really interesting how, yeah, you've got this really distinctive single movements. I don't think so. I wouldn't think that would be a barrier as such. It's probably that they've learned where the wetlands are and the adults are kind of moving between the regular ones, and then the juveniles first move with them and then eventually disperse. So I actually found that the male chicks came back and paired up and bred near where they were born, but the female chicks dispersed tens or hundreds of 100 plus kilometres somewhere completely different. So
So it sounds like us.
yeah, pretty much, yeah. There was a fair bit of movement, not a great lot of movement, but a bit of movement, especially from juveniles, between the different flocking sites too. Probably looking for a mate.
Any more questions?
I'm guessing that you haven't done enough research yet to see if wind farms are having an effect.
Yeah, so I haven't done any of that research myself. There's been people who've been doing mortality monitoring at operating wind farms, and so far no mortalities of Brolgas have been found. I can't quote how many wind farms that would be now or how many years. My project was really trying to kind of feed information at that sort of early stage where you identify which are the areas you should avoid. So if you avoid those areas, you shouldn't have any issues. Disturbance effects, I don't think we know much about yet. We do know that there's at least the chicks that I captured and put a tracker on one of them, they dispersed from MacArthur Wind Farm, and there was no impact on that particular family. It may not be so for every bird. Individual birds might be different. There's also another wind farm, Mount. It's just sort of south of Ballarat, between Ballarat and Geelong, where there's also been successful fledging of chicks from one pair. So far there hasn't been any direct mortality impacts that have been recorded, but jury's still out on whether there's any potential disturbance effects on, whether Brolgas get displaced for a certain distance or whether they get affected. But there's also so many other things that might affect breeding success as well that we know very little about. It is, yeah, like all research. Yeah. But yeah, that work is also ongoing. I mean, there's lots of monitoring now going on with it at a lot of those wind farms, particularly for Brolgas and a few of the other sort of key species.
One last question. Do you think currently habitat is the limiting factor in southwest Victoria or predation?
Habitat,
So
yeah.
we're pretty well fully stocked as far as Brolgas go with the habitat that we have. Is that fair?
Well, we don't know that 100% sure. I mean, we don't know whether there's actually pairs that could be breeding and we don't have enough wetlands for them.
Yep.
Or whether, there's enough wetlands for the population that we have currently. Certainly, in drier years, there's less recruitment. So I think that's a pretty good indication that wetlands are a limiting factor to fledging and to contributing to the population. And I think that that's a high sort of threat that's of more concern than predation, because it does seem like if there's like in high rainfall years when we've got lots of suitable habitats available, that we're also getting high recruitment, high fledging. So predation certainly doesn't seem to be an issue, at least in those wet years, which would suggest that if you've got wetlands that hold water long enough for the chicks to fledge, then the predation probably isn't an issue. I think what potentially happens is the wetlands dry up before the chicks fledge, and then they either die because there's no food for them, or when they're walking to another wetland, they're much more vulnerable to predation. Yeah, from foxes and birds of prey.